All right, next, in our study of congruent triangles, we're going to move on from side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, side, angle, and hypotenuse leg, and we're going to look at what happens after you prove the triangles are congruent, and that is when you use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or Cpctc. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. You use Cpctc when you are asked to prove that parts are congruent. What do we mean by parts? We mean sides and angles. Parts are considered to be sides of the triangle and angles of the triangle. But first, before you use Cpctc, you must prove that the triangles are congruent, which means that Cpctc does not show up in the middle of the proof, it shows up at the end of the proof. Just like before we had side, angle, side, 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 all that stuff showing up at the end of the proof, Cpctc is going to show up at the very end, okay? So in this problem, they have given us AB is congruent to AD, BC is congruent to DC. So let's go ahead and label those first. AB and AD, BC and DC, and I'm going to go ahead and write down both of those. And at this point, this part we know is pretty easy. This is the given information. And then the next one has one of our favorite properties, that is that AC is congruent to itself. AC is congruent to AC, and this is the reflexive property. So I know that the top triangle and the bottom triangle are congruent to each other by side, angle, side. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle ADC by side, side, side. Now, before today, we would be done. That would be the end of the proof. But today, they're not asking us to prove that the two triangles are congruent. They're asking us to take a step further, and now we're talking about angles. So once you have shown that the two triangles are congruent, that means that you can take it a step further and you can start talking about the angles. So that means that this angle is the same as this angle is the same as this angle, and this angle is the same as this angle. Because once the triangles are congruent, all of their corresponding parts are congruent as well. That's what Cpctc is all about. So now they said angle BCA and angle DCA. Angle BCA is this one over here. Let me show you. And then angle DCA is this one over here. That's the one that they're asking about. And those are congruent because they correspond to each other in the congruent triangles. So angle BCA is congruent to angle DCA, and that's because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. It is the very last step. All right, let's go ahead and do another example. PS is parallel to QR. I'm going to extend my parallel lines so I can work with them more easily. PS is parallel to QR. Okay. QPS angle is congruent to SRQ, so those two angles are congruent. Okay. And then let's go ahead and label this. PS is parallel to QR, and that's given. QPS is congruent to SRQ, that's given. All right, I have my two parallel lines, and I have this transversal. So if that's the transversal with my two parallel lines, then I can see that this angle between this parallel line and this transversal, and this angle between this parallel line and that transversal should be the same. And the reason for that is because alternate interior angles. So I have angle PSQ. PSQ is congruent to angle RQS. And the reason is alternate interior angles. And then I can see that this line that is shared between the two triangles is the same. It's shared, so it must be congruent to itself. So SQ is the same as QS, congruent to QS. That's the reflexive property. And so now I have enough information to say that the two triangles are congruent to each other. So triangle PSQ is congruent to triangle, PSQ is congruent to triangle RQS. And the reason for that is I've got two angles on a side. The side is not in between the two angles, so this is angle, angle, side. So my reason for that is angle, angle, side congruence. And so now that the two triangles are congruent, I can go ahead and label the rest of my drawing. So I can say that these other angles are the same. I can say that these sides are the same, and that these sides are the same. So they wanted me to prove that PQ and RS are congruent, and I know that they are. PQ is congruent to RS, and I know that they are because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right. Let's try another one. X is the midpoint of WY, so X is the midpoint of WY. That means that these two are the same. And VZ. Okay. We'll go ahead and write that down. X is the midpoint of WY. X is the midpoint of VZ, given, okay. Now, because of that, that means that these two are the same length and these two are the same length. So we have WX is congruent to YX. VX is congruent to ZX. And the reason for both of those is definition of a midpoint. Okay. And then here I can see that these two angles have to be the same. And the reason that I know that is because these are vertical angles. So I'm going to say angle WXV is congruent to angle YXZ, and that's because they are vertical angles. And so now I have enough information to say that the two triangles are congruent. Triangle WXV is congruent to triangle YXZ, and that's by, I have two sides and an angle, the angles between them, side, angle, side. They probably meant for me to put these two, this whole thing, as the given information instead of splitting it up, so I'll go ahead and just put the 7th step down here. Okay, so now that I have all of that, I can go ahead and put the rest of it together. So I've got that this corresponds with this, and this corresponds with this, and WV and YZ, oh, three lines, okay. So that means that XWV, let me go ahead and mark it in marker, XWV corresponds with XYZ, and we proved it. And that is by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So basically, the proofs, the flow of the proofs should feel very familiar up until this point. Your first goal, show that the triangles are congruent. Once you show that the triangles are congruent, then you can mark everything else that's congruent, and then your goal, whatever you were trying to prove, should be the next thing that you end up doing in the proof. And the reason you're able to do that is because all the corresponding parts of congruent triangles end up being congruent. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave these last two proofs for you guys to do. I think that you are more than capable of finishing these up. So these will be available to you on the answer key to check in class.